This podcast provides a platform to discuss important questions and complex issues, challenge the status quo, and confront the boundaries of the establishment. I'm retired Police Chief Daniel Hahn. I went from being arrested at 16 to serving over 34 years in law enforcement. My goal is to keep you informed with news not being reported, voices not being heard, and the untold history of how we got here so that we can create a way forward. Okay, so today I have a very special guest on our A Way Forward podcast, retired Chief Renee Hall, and I'd like to introduce her before we get started so you all know who she is. Renee Hall is a respected thought leader who is recognized for her 21st century policing leadership experience. She most recently, in law enforcement anyway, served as the police chief in Dallas, the first woman police chief who's African-American, and unless I'm mistaken, the only woman police chief in the history of Dallas with over 4,000 members and a over $500 million budget. She was the first, like I said, the first woman ever to serve as the police chief in Dallas and first African-American woman. She oversaw a department during some of the more challenging times in Dallas's history, unprecedented protests, COVID pandemic shutdowns, and the Black Lives Matter worldwide protests following the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis. Prior to Dallas, Renee spent 20 years in Detroit Police Department, her hometown, and has been quite busy since retirement. Renee Hall is the founder and CEO of TUU Enterprises, a law enforcement consulting firm. She provides assessments of police departments for areas of potential improvement in their policies and procedures. But Renee is also a Harvard University Fellow of the 2022 Advanced Leadership Initiative, and she currently serves as senior editor of the Harvard Social Impact Review. Renee has developed, in collaboration with Harvard professional schools and academic departments, a comprehensive program that provides intergenerational employment, increases literacy, and creates opportunities for wealth building through financial and educational training. And she also, and on top of all that, has partnered with a senior fellow at Harvard Law School and a London Metropolitan Police officer to launch Police in America, an 8-week pre-police academy that will prepare recruits to challenge the status quo of police culture through Ivy League academic training, leadership, organizational management and development, and mentorship. And I might end with a little bit about Renee's education. She happened to go to Grambling State University, and one of my best friends in the whole world went to Grambling. So she definitely brags about you all the time, and is also a graduate of the FBI National Academy, the 262nd Academy session. Welcome, Renee. Appreciate you being on here.
Thank you, Chief. It's so good to see you, and thank you for having me on. I'm so honored to be here.
This is awesome. So I know you have a pretty unique story, but in this time where we are having challenges across the country in recruiting officers, and specifically women officers and African-American officers, which has historically been a huge challenge to diversifying the departments across the country. Just a couple years ago, you chose to become a police officer. So I'm curious if you would tell us what made you want to be a police officer? Why did you become a police officer?
Well, Chief, the truth of the matter is I never wanted to be the police. My father was killed in the line of duty. He was a Detroit police officer. I was 6 months old. I had siblings. One was 2 and one was 3. We were stair steps. And so it left our family devastated. My father's murder is still one of the only unsolved murders in the history of the Detroit Police Department from a Detroit police officer standpoint. And so it was not my first love. But when I was in graduate school at the University of Detroit Mercy, I had finished undergrad and I thought I was going to be a lawyer. I was supposed to be Ketanji Brown Jackson. That's who I was supposed to be. And I was in, a graduate program that was designed to be a Juris Doctorate and a master's. And the chief of police was actually one of my professors. Benny Napoleon, he was, God rest his soul, COVID took him in 2021. But a longtime mentor. We met, we would have back and forth banter, from an educational perspective, from a law enforcement perspective. And he told me, you need to join my police department. And I thought he was nuts. He did not know my story. He didn't know my history, my father. But he said, in 7 years, you'd be a lieutenant and you will be a police chief. I see it all over you.
Wow.
So he stayed on top of me, Chief. He did. And so I eventually gave in. I believe that law enforcement is a calling because once I decided to apply, everything moved so fast and everything I touched was successful. First time I ever held a gun, I shot expert. Every time I went out for something, it was almost if God laid it out for me. And so I believe that law enforcement was calling me to it. And I'll say this, the outcome may have been different if his administration looked different. He was a man who had 7 sisters. And when you looked in the police department, almost every area of the police department was run by women and Black women, strong women. And so when I looked into the agency, I could see myself at the top of the agency simply because there were individuals who looked just like me. And I asked him, I said, why so many women? And he said, you want anything done? He said, I grew up in a house with a mother and 7 sisters. And if you want anything done and done well, you have a woman to do it. And so I will say, as you started your conversation about law enforcement being tough and to recruit and recruiting women, a lot of our agencies, if we're truly honest, we look across this country, we don't see women at the helm.
Absolutely.
And we don't see African American women at the helm. And when we do, there's so much strife, there's so much challenge to those individuals. And that is the only time you hear the words incompetent is when a woman is leading an organization, or unskilled. That's never a term that's given to a man. Men are deemed to be competent in law enforcement. We are a minority when you look at the statistics. Of the 800,000 members that are law enforcement, 12%, 13% maybe are women. And so that leaves 87% men and about 70% white men. And so when you're asking yourself, can you recruit? You ask yourself, how do I show individuals who are in the agency now that this is a career that they would flourish in, that they would want to be? No one. I give this example often. If you and I took a selfie, and after it was developed, we passed it around, and I looked at it and say, hey, I look great. And you said, I don't want this picture. I can't see myself. It cut me off. If you don't see yourself within a thing, you don't feel a part of it and you don't want any part of it. And so I believe that we have to do a better job of the 12 or 13% of women that are in the agency to ensure that they have the training, that they get the mentoring and the coaching to be in leadership roles, because that's the only way we're going to have young women across this country wanting to sit in a seat, is when they see someone who's sitting there who looks like them.
Not to mention, you have people like Don Lemon, who recently said that women are past their prime once they hit 40.
Gosh. And I'm gonna be honest. I absolutely love me some Don Lemon. I do, but I really was very shocked. But again, it's when do we say men are past their prime? It's like
never. Never.
But
we have a president that's almost 80, and we don't say that about him.
We barely say that, but we have a shelf life. So he's on ice right now. Poor thing.
Absolutely. So, as the first woman to ever serve as police chief in Dallas, who's also African American, what do you think you brought uh, to the table in Dallas, and just as a Black woman, bring to any police chief role? Since there's very few examples of that across our country, what do you feel that your experience as a Black woman brought to the position of police chief, leading one of the largest agencies in the country?
So I want to start with the woman. And I want to say that women, as my mentor told me a long time ago, if you want something done, call a woman to do it. And this is no slight on men, but we are taught at very young ages because we watch our mothers. And we're taught as young women to be able to multitask, to take care of the home, to manage the kids, to be able to hold together the bills, the household, the marriage, all of these things women are taught to do very early on. We bring those same skills of understanding, of empathy, of communicating. We communicate a lot differently, and in this profession, law enforcement, that's what we lack so much of, is the communication and the understanding. The Bible tells us that in all things to get an understanding. So to be able to merge the two worlds together of law enforcement and community, women do that differently. I won't say better, but we do it differently and in a way that feels more empathetic, because we get to be nurturing, we get to be the individuals that make things all right. Men have this macho ego bravado that comes in it actually shows up oftentimes in the workplace. And when, as a woman, you get a chance to be able to do what you do at home, and that's bring things together and make sure that they gel and they fit, even when it's chaotic. So that's what a woman brings to law enforcement. But as a Black woman, what I bring is a level of knowledge and understanding of what we went through as a people.
Yes.
And that's not just as a woman, but as anyone, you as a police chief being an African American, we have a duty and a responsibility to ensure that water hoses and dogs and all of those things that our people endured never happen again. We get to say that. The Jewish community gets to say, we want to make sure that you know our history so that it never happens again. We in the African American community, when we get in these seats, we could not always sit here. This was a place that African Americans could not be for years. We didn't show up until the late 60s, early 70s. So now that we have a role and a place, it is our responsibility to change the culture and change the dynamics of what policing was actually established for. We have a duty to the people and to ourselves to ensure that the integrity of the organization is intact and that we take care of our communities. And so that's what I think I brought to the city of Detroit and equally the city of Dallas, but it was much more challenging in Dallas.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I often say that, like in Dallas, it's probably almost 2 centuries old, and
Mhm.
they just recently hired their first woman as police chief. So is that because no women were qualified before, or something else? So, um, so you and I have talked many times, and I know there's unique challenges of being an African American police chief, or being the first African American police chief. But I think there's a whole nother layer of challenges also as a woman, on top of the challenges of just being Black. What were some of the challenges or unique situations that you faced in Dallas because you were the first, and because you were the only, still to this day, the only woman to ever lead that police department?
Well, it's unfortunate that you have to ask this question. It's
I agree.
very disappointing that and disheartening that we have to even discuss this. Um, But it it began when they announced that I was going to be the chief, that I was taking the job. The city manager announced that he was hiring a woman, and it was the first Black woman. And the headlines was, "Is the city of Dallas ready for a woman?" As if we were saying, "Are we ready for an alien from Mars?" I mean, what do you mean, are we ready for a woman? There was many women on the Dallas Police Department. There was women in the, assistant chief and deputy chief ranks within the police department. Why would the city have to brace themselves for a woman to sit in the seat? And then everything became about me being a woman the entire time I was the chief. And you never hear me talk about this because it's I know the role I played and the successes that I brought to the city and to the police department. But I'll say this on this podcast: the news articles were never about my ability to do the job. It was
Oh,
about
absolutely.
my
Yeah.
lashes, my
Yep.
fingernails, the
Yep.
color lipstick I wore, if I were in plain clothes, what that looked like. I have never seen a story about a man's suit, a male police chief suit. I've never heard about his haircut, when he got his haircut, where he got a haircut, what time of day that was. Those were the things. Even in the way you display the new police chief. I had the magazine that took 1,000 photos of me. They waited until I got in uniform because when I arrived in the city of Dallas, it was a different, unique situation. For the first 90, maybe 110 days, they had me on this tour, the speaking tour and meeting tour. I didn't even test for my, um, to sit for the test for the state exam for like 4 months because the first 3 months
Well, and I remember there
were
was a lot of stories about that too.
absolutely. And here's the thing: the same media who was writing the stories were the same media who had set all the agenda. They were at every single event. I had meetings lined up with them for 30, 60 days. And so the story, they took all these pictures of me, and the one picture that they decided to run was a picture of me at the gun range holding a gun. And of course, it was to demean and, to minimize, the fact of who I was. But if all you have is a police officer on the gun range with a gun, if you think that's negative, then let's roll with it.
Right. Right.
It became so much nonsense, that I don't even know that if they knew all of the things I did. When I left, when I resigned, and the city manager listed all of my accomplishments, people were amazed because while they were telling stories about fingernail color polish and lashes and hair, I was running a police agency and changing the culture and being innovative and bringing to the ninth largest city in the country. They could not even do police reports online, so I had to bring in technology, to be able to actually run the police department, to be able to get some interoperability between CAD, RMS, and to be able to just function, to
Right.
get body worn cameras, all of the things that we have to do to run an agency. I was busy doing while the news was reporting about me being a woman and lipstick and those kinds of things. So when you say what are the challenges, imagine waking up to um what color lipstick you wear. That's the news of the day. Those, this chief wears makeup. Like, seriously, like, are we are
And not to mention what you said earlier, no, the whole time knowing all well that you're looking at these other chiefs that don't have those questions or those comments or have to waste their time dealing with those issues, right?
any
So
of that, any of that. So what it was exactly what you said. When you're the first, you have to endure so that there can be others behind you. But what's so disheartening is that sometimes it's so challenging, that when young African American women, young white Hispanic women look and say how they treated this chief. I had there's a deputy chief in the police department right now that I won't mention her name, but she needs to be a chief somewhere. And she told me, and I mentored her. She was a sergeant or lieutenant when I came in the organization. And when I left, she was in an acting assistant chief's role. When I tell you she's amazing, she's absolute a Caucasian female, absolutely amazing. She told me, I'm not interested in that job. I saw how they treated you. And I saw that they treated you that way for no good reason. So she doesn't even want it.
Right.
How disappointing, how disheartening is that? How many other young women in the agency felt that way because of what I had to endure? But I had to endure it so that there can be another. But I have to now mentor and coach individuals to sit in that seat that is very challenging for people who look like us.
I've seen that repeatedly, female officers that don't want to move up because of that and other challenges, just simply because they're women. So,
Yeah.
there's a lot of articles that have been written over the years, especially in the last couple of years, about Black police chiefs, Black leaders in law enforcement. So just recently, USA Today interviewed myself and several other Black police chiefs that are either current or retired. And they mentioned in this article the challenges that, the pushback that they get from some in the Black community, some pushback that they get within internal to the police departments. And one of the things they mentioned was this expectation that because you're a Black police chief, you're going to solve all the problems pretty quickly, especially any issues or lack of trust in the Black community and those sort of things. So, just recently we had a pretty tragic incident in Memphis where a young man was basically beaten to death by at least 5 Black police officers. So, as somebody with some very unique experiences like you, both as a police chief and just as a Black woman in general, I'm curious, what was your gut reaction when that first occurred, where you could see the video where these 5 officers beat this man repeatedly?
So one, I just I can't. My heart goes out to Tyree's family, and I cannot stop praying enough for them. And CJ Davis, the chief, we're sorority sisters. She's a good friend of mine, and I just want to say she's absolutely amazing, and she handled the
I
situation
agree.
phenomenally. But what I saw, what when I saw the video, it did not give me the kind of pause that people were looking for, because what I saw was a culture of policing. That there is a culture that exists in policing that allows individuals wearing a uniform to exhibit supreme authority over individuals who are civilian, and especially when they're African American. Um, this did not shock me that they were African American, because
Me neither.
I mean, it did not shock me because they were African American, because you and I have policed for many years, and you see that culture eats policy for breakfast. And if you are not careful, you will fall victim to the very culture that tells us that the enemy is in our community, and that, how we deal with individuals in our community, criminals, just because they're criminals, do not make them any less people. Um, but it will allow you to fall prey to this superiority and to the abuse that we are responsible for eliminating out of our police agencies, because we're African American and we know what that's like. It's everybody's responsibility, but we have, I believe, a higher expectation and more of a responsibility to ensure that these things don't happen, because we know what they do to people overall, but ultimately what they've done to us in the past, and the reason why the relationships are so tumultuous to begin with. What I will say about having the expectation that we can fix it all, um, it's absurd. And it was very frustrating in my role to find that there were communities who had been fighting for years. Like in the city of Dallas, they had been fighting for 40 years for an oversight board. When I came in, I was able to help, but it wasn't just because I was a Black woman and a Black police chief that I could help. We had a tragic incident where a police officer killed an unarmed Black man in his own apartment, that pushed that needle. So for them to expect that one person can come in, like Jesus, and turn water into wine and turn around centuries of systemic racist systems, and create this harmonious relationship for African Americans and police, it's unheard of. I mean, we can't be expected to do all things, because they don't expect that from our counterparts.
Right.
Now, I do believe that we have a responsibility, but we have to be given the opportunity and the time that it takes to do these things. We're in a dichotomy in that we are African American, but we're also police officers. And so where there are some concerns in law enforcement, all law enforcement is not bad. And
Right.
every
Right.
member of the police department is not the enemy and is not out to shoot an unarmed African American individual. And so what we have to be given is grace to say we're all fighting for the same thing. But there's no one walking through an agency or a community that says, I am racist, or I don't like Black people, or I intend to shoot someone today. That's not how that works. So it's our responsibility to make sure that we're communicating, that we create accountability within our police agencies, that we're transparent, that we have best practices, and that we listen to our community to see what it is that they need and what they want, and incorporate those things in our general orders. And that's our responsibility, to build those bridges. But we need help to do that. And sometimes we're getting it from both ends. We're getting it from the community. We're getting it from the police officers. We're not Black enough. We're not blue enough. Um, and the responsibility is too great for any one person to have to hold, because our counterparts don't have to hold those same levels of responsibility.
Absolutely. You mentioned Chief C.J. Davis and the great job she did. I agree with you. And I think a large reason why we didn't see more widespread protests and unrest in Memphis and elsewhere around the country like we have previous is in large part due to her coming out pretty quickly and condemning the actions of her officers, releasing the video, and also Tyree Nichols' mother, how she also responded to. I think those two were probably some of the biggest reasons why we didn't see things. But yet, I can't help but wonder, in the aftermath now of the video being released, it seems like there's a lot of effort put into researching CJ Davis's background and all the things came before. And I just don't know if I recall any other chiefs having that happen after a tragic situation like that. So again, I think it might, at least in part, be because she's a Black woman in a position where there's not very many.
Absolutely. And again, we have to endure that does not exist for others. But one of the things that I will say is that she did set a precedent. We have to admit that her coming out as swiftly as she did, every police agency doesn't have that autonomy, nor to be able to terminate individuals that quickly.
Right.
And so I'm thankful. There needs to be a national standard that allows us to be able to do these things. And I think that was probably why the attacks are so great, is because she did set a precedent. And not only did she set a precedent. What she did brought the largest activists in the United States.
Yes.
Well, he's an attorney, Ben Crump. He actually supported her in her decision making. And
Right.
so for the first time in a long time, you have the activists, the police, and the family all on the same page, all saying the same thing. And how uncomfortable does that make individuals who don't want to see this happen? I mean, I believe that the majority of the country would say this is the way things are supposed to go. But that group that, is not is dead set on, we're going to keep these officers on the job. We're not going to allow anyone to be able to terminate them, quickly and prosecute them swiftly. And there's a group of individuals out there who don't want that to happen. Then that is who is going after CJ's history. But what we know is who she is as an individual, who we all as individuals, and we'll let her good work, let the work she's done speak for her.
Yeah. I think we also have to recognize, it doesn't change that somebody lost their life at the hands of police officers. It doesn't change what we watch on that video and how horrific. I think pretty much the whole country saw what happened and agrees that. But, I can't help but also think that 5-10 years ago, the response to this that Chief Davis did wouldn't have happened in probably any city. So there is some progress, at least after the fact, on some of these tragedies to build trust and transparency, because I don't think we saw any department. I know we haven't saw any department do that 5-10, so not very long ago. So
Absolutely.
you have such unique experiences in your professional life and law enforcement and just your personal life, but also after your retirement, you've done so many things that we talked about at the beginning of this podcast. So what do you think? We have impoverished communities, oftentimes very diverse minority communities that have lived in poverty for decades and decades in every major city across this country. So what do you think we should be as a society, not necessarily law enforcement, but just as a society, as leaders in our communities? What do you think needs to be done, or we need to think about and do to change the dynamics in these communities that seem to oftentimes gobble people up and take dreams away, or not even allow dreams to be had in the first place? What do you think we as a country and cities across our country need to be doing and thinking about to change that?
Well, I think if we just listen to academics and look at the statistics, academics everywhere, whether it's Stanford, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, have stated that poverty is a direct correlation to crime. And so when we look at these communities, we are not surprised that there's criminal activity, because people are living in trauma. When you have to choose between whether to feed your children or put gas in the car or pay a light bill, that's trauma. And it desperate times calls for desperate measures. I am not excusing criminal behavior. What I'm saying is that the poverty that is in this country, that has been allowed to fester and progress in this country, is the reason that we see crime in these neighborhoods, which then calls for police to come in and fill a role that they should not. A social worker, a homeless advocate, a mental health professional, as well as try and reduce the criminal activity that are within these communities. And so it is our responsibility in this country to focus on those things that create barriers for individuals to be successful. When we look at this country, and I'll take Detroit for instance, 40% of the people in the city of Detroit live below the poverty level. There's a 47% illiteracy rate.
In a
80%
city that used to be thriving.
and a city that was the first, that produced the first Black middle class.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And so now we're here and we are wondering why there are 300 plus homicides in a city with less 600,000 people. Well, if people have no education and they have no skills, then that means they have no jobs. And if you don't have a job, you don't you can't provide for your family. And so this is a cycle. So our country should be focused on how we create wealth opportunities for individuals. I am not talking about a handout, talking about a hand up. I'm saying when we don't just give people a minimum wage job. A minimum wage job gives someone a key to poverty. A minimum wage job will not pay your rent. These in any city, you'd have to make 3 times the rent in order for you to be able to qualify for an apartment. Well, the average apartment is $2,000 in most cities, and $1,500 to $2,000. So people are not making that in a minimum wage job. So what do we do in order for us to bring these individuals up to a living wage, a thriving wage? We have to provide them, one, with employment opportunities, but also education, training, mentoring, and financial literacy. Our country is not aware of the fact that simple life insurance policies change people's lives. Owning a home changes people's lives. We forget African Americans weren't even able to read until
Or
the
buy a home.
or buy a home. We all of these things. So when you have generations of individuals who have been impoverished for so long, it's a cycle. And we are not, as a country, doing what we can to ensure that individuals can pull themselves out of a cycle. We want them to pull themselves up by a bootstrap. And you've heard this before. If you have no boots, there's no straps to hang on to. So one of the things at Harvard University that we talk about is social impact and social justice. We need to ensure that individuals have what they need in this country. We're one of the richest countries in the world. If we can feed other countries and provide aid to other countries, there should be no homeless people living in the United States of America, and there should be no 40% 40% of a city living below the poverty level, and 47% of individuals illiterate in any city, in any state in the United States. So that's our responsibility, and that is what the next chapter of my life is focused on, is making sure that we address those issues, because when we address those issues, we address the police's issues. Because if we eliminate that level of poverty, people are going to work, they're not committing crimes. They're not in the suburban communities because everybody has a job, everyone's getting up, going to school, going to work. We don't have those levels of criminal activity. But where there is impoverished individuals, you're going to have criminal activity. I will ask you, what else are they going to do?
Right. I agree. And on top of that, I think what I've seen over and over is, even whether they're activists or leaders, politicians that are talking about, we need less police or those sort of things. When crime goes up, I saw during the health pandemic, the answer was send the police. And I think you can even point to that in Memphis, where when you listen to the city manager and others talk, their priority was to lower the crime that was rising, and their solution was the police, as opposed to all the things you just talked about in addition to the police. There's no doubt that police are needed to hold people accountable, but there'll be an endless line unless we stop the flow, right? Unless we do this holistically in this community and help people raise themselves up and be able to chase their dreams. So I'm curious, before I ask you this next question, I meant to ask you this earlier, and then I got sidetracked listening to you. You mentioned Napoleon was one of the biggest emphasis on how you joined Detroit Police Department. Not only what he would say to you, but the example he had in his department for you to see in terms of the women in leadership positions. I know he was still alive when you started reaching some of these unprecedented heights in your career. I'm curious if willing, you would be willing to share any of the things he said to you as you're attaining these things, because I imagine he had a few things to say.
Yeah, there were so many words of wisdom, Chief. He always talked about um, the pushback, and that you were always going to have detractors, and you could always tell your level of success and what impact you were making by how large the detractor group was. Just always push forward. He always talked about being a woman in this role, how challenging it was going to be. But one of the things that he said, no matter what circumstance or scenario presented itself, he always encouraged me, in my faith. He was a man of faith, and so am I. And he just encouraged me to continue to push forward because we had work to do. It was our responsibility to ensure that the next generation had a great place to live, work, and play, and that our police agencies were uh, people could be proud of. We did not start with our people being proud of the law enforcement, and in the roles that I attained and that you have attained, it was important for him to make sure that I always remembered what my responsibility was, and that was to make the department better at every rank, and to leave it better than you found it. And that was our role, and I think that's still our role. As you and I have gone on to different things, we still have a duty and a responsibility to ensure that law enforcement has what it needs, that individuals coming into the role have what they need, and that the culture that exists within law enforcement is conducive for a harmonious relationship between police and community. And that's our responsibility, both in the community and in the police department, even though we're no longer there.
Well, I'll say, as somebody that has observed you for a while, I think you upheld what he told you. But that brings me to my last question for you. Same sort of thing that he did for you is so somebody listening to this that is considering law enforcement, considering a career in law enforcement, what advice would you give them? Whether it's a woman or young, older man, woman, black, white, Hispanic, what advice would you give somebody that's considering a career in law enforcement now?
I would encourage them with every part of me to join. I would remind them of Gandhi's words: "Be the change you want to see." It's good. It's important to fight on the outside, but you can truly make more effective impact by working from the inside. I believe in law enforcement. I believe that law enforcement is still a very noble profession, but we need to ensure that individuals that are working in that profession have the same level of integrity and nobility in their hearts and minds. This is a job of the heart. This is not a job of bravado. This is not a career of medals and accomplishments. It is about people. It is about taking care of those individuals who can't take care of themselves, and that is our responsibility as people. That is what God has called us to do. His word says, "What you do for the least of these, you do for me." And so that is our responsibility. And I would encourage everyone who is considering law enforcement to do it, to go for it. We're there. We're here. I'm here. Daniel, I know you're here to provide anything that they need, and to make sure that we're fighting on the outside to ensure that they're successful in their plight.
You know, I can't help but to think you remind me of two people that I respect uh, more than most, and that's the two first women to ever serve in all the entire Sacramento region. Were two women that joined the Sacramento Police Department in 1974, and they were both African American, the first ever in this entire region, and they went through pure hell. not only for being women, but also being Black. The racial things that happened to them, literally their safety was put into danger repeatedly. I mean, to listen to their story and think that that was in the 70s is pretty shocking to most people that hear it. Yet they love the Sacramento Police Department and they
Absolutely.
repeat it over and over. And so I just heard you say to somebody considering law enforcement to go for it and do it, even though you've gone through many challenges in your own career, a lot of which are solely because you're a woman and maybe solely because you're Black, and yet you still have that. I'm just I'm just curious why. Why are you still so adamant about law enforcement and that people with the right mindset and the right heart should do it?
Because it's important. Law enforcement is responsible for order in individual cities and as a whole in this country. And who would we rather have at the helm? Individuals with the right hearts and minds, regardless of the scrutiny, or what's the largest threat to the United States of America is white supremacy. Who do we want at the helm of law enforcement? I know who I want there. And so, yes, if you have to endure some scrutiny, if you have to endure a little bit of pain, I had a protective detail, had many threats. The FBI locked up individuals for making threats and leaving things at my home. It's all worth it if individuals in this country can say, when I call the police, they come and they come in support of me and not to prey on me. And so that's important for me. And I pray that it's important for the rest of this country and that individuals coming into law enforcement will have the same heart and mind to take care of our people, because that's exactly what we need to do.
And what you just said is why I'm so appreciative that you come on the show, because it's the untold stories and challenges that people persevere through and still lead their organization or do whatever line of work they're doing and aren't talking about those things publicly, but they still had to endure them. So thank you for not only being here, but for what you've been through and how you've led. So I want to end today on this. You are definitely not somebody that's just sitting around in retirement enjoying, the good life and the fruits of all your labor. You have definitely been active. I can't help but think of the times when before you had taken the test as police chief, the Texas test. I just felt like there was overtones like questioning whether you could pass that test. And now I'm looking at you at Harvard. So, so
It's
I
never a
just
question whether I could pass that test or
so
not.
whoever might have been thinking about that, look at you now. And then for that fact. So just want people to know, you do a lot of speaking and sharing your experiences, both in law enforcement and outside of law enforcement. You do consulting. And as we mentioned at the top of this, you do some work in how do we lift up communities in Detroit and elsewhere. So if somebody wanted to get you to come and speak with their organization or any of the other things that you do, how would they get a hold of you and how would they go about um, procuring your services?
So my website, Two Enterprises, capital TUU Enterprises LLC. It's twoenterprises.com, and you can go there and you can see all the services that I provide. I'm also Police for America. We just launched that myself, Saul and Aaron. It's a 8-week training academy, and we're focusing on 8 weeks prior to them going into cadets going into a police agency, trying to radically change the culture of law enforcement. And I can also be reached at Renee at policeforamerica.com. So those are the two places that you can reach me.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Renee. It's good to see you in person, or virtually in person, I guess I should say. And I wish you nothing but health, happiness, and much success. You are in my opinion, a leader in our country, not just in law enforcement, but other things. And I'm so glad to see that you are not letting grass grow under your feet. So
Well,
thank you and
thank
good
you
seeing you.
so much. So good to see you too. Thank you so much. And many
All right.
blessings to you. Continue it.
One of the big purposes of A Way Forward is to hear different voices and different opinions, because that is how we can make informed decisions ourselves. So if you are someone that would like to come on A Way Forward to express your opinion, go to chiefhahn.com/podcast. Chief, HAHN.com/podcast.